It's that time again. It's Sunday morning, time for Boneheaded Boaters and football. Well, at least this time of year. That's one of the big things that happens here in the fall as we start to roll into the winter is focus starts changing. People aren't quite as into boating and they start looking at other hobbies and things to do instead of maybe getting out there and taking the boat out. Maybe they'll just watch football on Sunday. Maybe they'll go out and find a different way to hit the water other than actually using the boat. But one thing's for sure. Things don't really change all that much as the people who are still getting out there hitting the water still wind up making mistakes and finding their way into trouble, or even finding their way onto the hard like our last surfer did, or like this boater did, and some of the other things we'll witness in this episode of Boneheaded Boaters of the Week.
Good place to park.
Now, of course, like we'll see in this episode, there are plenty of ways to get your boat onto the hard. It could be on a jetty like we just saw, or maybe you'll go ahead and run that boat straight up onto the dock, but there's still other ways of doing it. Maybe you wind up on the hard on the sandbar. Now, at least for this crew who's out on the sandbar, they just gotta wait for the tide to come up and they'll probably be on their way. Now, our guy here took taking the boat to the hard to the absolute extremes as he's taking it straight onto the concrete. Now, I'm gonna need some of y'all Toon Boys out there to go ahead and chime in the comments and let me know exactly what's going on here. Obviously, it appears there is some sort of trailer underneath the pontoon, but it is just not giving enough clearance for him to keep this thing off the ground as we see it dragging the concrete here. This is obviously not designed like this, right? Let me know in the comments, is he just using the wrong trailer or is he rigged something together in an emergency use? Because I'm not 100% sure. Now, this boater takes it to a different extreme when trying to run it up on the hard because he's trying to run it right up onto the other boat. Maybe that boat's in his parking spot and he's just trying to move it. Now, if he was just trying to move this boat out of his way, it seems like he was successful at least in that task, but I'm betting one of these boats wish they'd moved out of the way. Now, the odd one in this one was my man either wasn't looking or something else was going on because there's no way he couldn't have seen this crew just sitting here because they weren't even really moving as they were just fishing in the middle of the channel. And speaking of the middle of the channel, nothing like dropping another reef, but I'm really confused on this one. I mean, this line could have easily gotten caught on something and gotten stuck. Doesn't seem like a good place to have it. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong on that. Now, this crew thought they were going out to enjoy a day of fishing in the middle of the channel, but they're going to be fishing all right, but they're not going out to catch fish with the tail. They're going to be fishing for something else. People often ask how these ones happen. There's many ways they go wrong, but probably the most surprising one is somebody doesn't get it into park. They think they're going into park and leave it in reverse. Now, it looks like this crew is going to be fishing for some stairs. I mean, I guess that's what happens when you wind up rushing around the dock. You start forgetting things, like maybe forgetting to pull the anchor.
Give it hell!
But there are plenty of times when you're out there enjoying a day of boating, you'll find yourself rushed. But one of the times I see people the most rush is when they're finishing the day out. You've been out in the water, enjoyed a long day, and now you just want to get that boat back on the trailer and get home. Now, speaking of things being on the hard or vessels out there being on the hard, this one's not really that, but this one's just hard. For whatever reason, I always watch these guys in the jet cars, always are struggling around the docks, and in this case it's no different. They wound up into the yacht, they wind up into the dock, and it appears this is at the Fort Lauderdale International Boat Show. I'm not sure if they're setting up to be part of the show, or if they just wound up going through there, but apparently these cars had a little more struggles than this even, as somebody sent me a clip. I don't have it in front of me right this second, but apparently one of these cars wound up sinking at the Fort Lauderdale International Boat Show over by where the water taxi dock is. Not sure if it's one of these two exactly, but it was definitely a black-hulled water car flipped upside down, getting assistance from local authorities. And speaking of one of the hardest things on the water, that's going to be that person that has to work the pump out station at the dock. Definitely a job I don't want.
Every time I watch it, I'm like, it's not what's funny then, but it's funny now. Oh my god.
Definitely one of those jobs I don't want to have to deal with, and definitely don't want to be the person who has to clean that up in the end either. And speaking of cleaning up messes, nothing like trying to leave the sandbar to run into a mess like this. The boat we see in the picture here is actually a towboat. He pauses so the other vessel we see on the right can get around him into the deeper water. The deeper waters on the left-hand side or the port side of the vessel were on board here, but they decided to go to the shallow side, and for whatever reason, they wind up smacking into the towboat as they're doing it. Not sure why they didn't go deeper, but here in a second you'll see the sandbar is actually on that left-hand side. They wind up pushing off and actually heading toward the boats on the sandbar. Now, another one of those things that's hard to do on the water is going to be to predict the weather. Sure, when you see storms coming, you can bunker down, but you never know how bad it's going to be.
Dude! Bro. Dude! Oh my god.
Then, of course, another thing that people seem to struggle with is navigating bridges. I mean, only if the bridge let you know what the height clearance was. Now, this is definitely one of those interesting ones that kind of sounds worse than it was. At first, I thought it was going to be terrible, but when you really see the boat coming out, somehow it looks like they came out fairly unscathed. I don't see anything missing. It really sounds like they were just smacking poles, so not as bad as it wound up sounding. And speaking of things being not as bad as they wind up sounding, sometimes going out and enjoying a day out on the water with the boys sounds like a good time. Sometimes it's not, and in this situation, you can just tell they're out there having fun, but for how long? Let me know in the comments if you think the same thing I do. This boat's going under at some point. And I always thought this had to be one of the harder things out there to tackle as well, and that's navigating the Miami River as one of these tugboats. Here it winds up running into a tender that's attached to a yacht, but there's not a lot of room to work, and these things are absolutely massive when they're out there, typically carrying these barges around. I often wonder how often this happens where these things wind up hitting something like this and then they just keep moving exactly like this crew does. But thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Boneheaded Boaters of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening out on your waterways, be sure to hit us up at Broncos Guru on Facebook or Instagram and let us know, and you might see your stories over here, just like Austin Byron, Captain Chris Towboat Adventures, and Will Stiles did this week. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button.